Welcome to Peter and Phil's Courageous Conversations, a podcast addressing race relations and social issues in hopes that you'll be inspired to do the same. Now, let's begin our conversation with your hosts, Dr. Peter Weinstein and Dr. Philip Nelson.
Welcome to Peter and Phil's Courageous Conversations. We first want to thank Nationwide for supporting our podcast and having the courage to support podcasts on social justice. We are excited to have Dr. Lisa Greenhill, Chief Diversity Officer and Senior Director for Institutional Research at AAVMC, American Association of Veterinary Medical Colleges. She has been a mover and a shaker, and our listeners may not know this. She has had a huge influence on the development of diversity in the veterinary profession. She has provided significant guidance through some tumultuous times, especially during the past half of a decade. And we're just fortunate to have her. Lisa, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you. I had a lot of black hair when we first met.
Yes, so did I. Yeah, and I think you caused some of my gray hair. Anyway, why don't you first tell us how you got involved in this area and tell us about your early years at AAVMC.
Okay. All right. As Phil mentioned, I'm Lisa Greenhill, pronouns she, her, hers. And I originally joined AAVMC staff for the very first time, December of 96. I was moving over. I had worked for about 18 months with the American Association of Medical Colleges and saw an opportunity to move to AAVMC. And I figured at that time, well, how hard could it be? Medical schools. Quickly found that it was quite different. Certainly a lot of parallels and similarities, but I learned a lot. And it also allowed me to draw on some of my own kind of lived experiences, having one parent from a rural background as well. That kind of served me well. And I left and came back a few times. I'm one of AAVMC's boomerangs, in addition to our CEO, Andy McCabe. I left to go to grad school, came back to the association around 2000 or so, and then left again and came back in 2004 to lead Diversity Matters, which is our diversity initiative at AAVMC. And I've been with AAVMC ever since. It's been such a huge part of my life at this point.
You mentioned that you went to grad school. You have a PhD. You're formally trained in this area. Would you mind sharing what your degree is in?
I left to go to grad school the first time, and I did a master's in public administration with a specialization in health policy. Then I went back and I actually did a EDD, so a doctorate in education, and it focuses on, of course, higher education administration and organizational change. My research focused on diversity, accreditation, standards, how people really feel about change in academic veterinary medicine in particular. And I've really kind of leveraged a lot of my doctoral work specifically in the area of diversity. And so that's really kind of where I scholarly hang out and read a lot of diversity journals, higher education journals, those types of things. And so, yeah, it's been a great journey.
I spent about 6 weeks working with you in AAVMC in the early 2000s, or was it the late 1990s? I forget now. It's been a while. But can you tell us some of the special projects that you've taken on that you are most proud of?
There are two big areas that I feel like I've focused much of my time on. And the first one is climate, institutional climate, particularly for students, but in the more probably last decade or so for everyone within the college, really kind of understanding what inclusion looks like, feels like, how do people describe it, who are they linking up with, where are they finding support, is there support, and also kind of using a lot of that data to recommend institutional changes. So for example, sometime in the last decade between pandemic time and just age, I've kind of lost track of the years, but during the height of the kind of bathroom controversies around trans individuals, particularly trans women, using public restrooms, we had a lot of students who were not necessarily identifying as trans, but maybe non-binary or somewhere on the gender spectrum, and bathroom usage was becoming an issue within our colleges. And, so much like, oh, what are we going to do? Just take male, female signs down and it'll be okay. I promise you it'll be okay. And so the climate work was certainly something that I've spent a lot of time, and I'm really proud of the work that we've done, and there's still a lot to do. The other area is really looking at admissions and the experiences of applicants during the veterinary admissions process. And so everything kind of leading up to the moment of application and kind of through. And so at AAVMC, I head up a couple of annual surveys of applicants and kind of what those experiences are. And then we really try to link some of that information to what is happening on the ground level at the colleges and kind of trying to determine, are there areas in the admissions process in which certain populations, underrepresented populations or otherwise marginalized populations, are experiencing the admissions process very differently, evidence of maybe some bias, and kind of how do we think about and talk about these areas of potential marginalization for certain populations within the admissions program. So that's where I'm spending a little bit more of my research time right now. We're doing all kinds of really cool things, and I'm hoping that they will have an enduring impact, certainly, on the future of our ability to not only maintain the diversity that we have, but continue to increase it.
I'm going to turn it over to my partner right now. And Peter, be careful with her. She's a friend. Okay.
Let her rip.
I understand that, Phil, and the one here with the least gray hair. Lisa, first of all, it's an honor. We have been in the room a number of different times. I have heard you present and educate and inform and share your thoughts, and you are a breath of fresh air. You speak your mind on Twitter as well. I really do appreciate your perspective on the veterinary profession as somebody who came from the outside in. I mean, Phil and I have the genetic mutation of being a veterinarian. You're drinking from a fire hose when it comes down to the veterinary profession. It's interesting because in your discussion and introductions in answer to some of Phil's questions, you talked about change and you talked about climate. Well, I put the two together and said climate change. It's not just the weather and it's not just solar, but we have climate change in our profession that's been going on. And Phil and I have talked about this in many different ways. I found articles that go back 30 years that called veterinary medicine the whitest profession. That hasn't changed. How do you deal with the slowness of change? Because that's the problem I had. This is what some of what Phil and I started out with in the past is I'm a change agent and I like to see things move much more rapidly. How do you have the patience to deal with the slow change that we see in the veterinary profession?
Well, I can answer that, I guess, in a number of different ways, including asking, well, how are we defining slow, right? And so if you're thinking about a country that has not the best history, I'm being extraordinarily tactful and polite, probably not like I am on Twitter, but, a country that really has such a, frankly, dark history of white supremacy and sexism and all the isms and phobias, all of the things, right? And how long it took to outlaw slavery, to then get to the passage of civil rights acts and voting rights and desegregation, all these types of things, right? And so on the one hand, change is happening rapidly in a larger context, but it's never going to happen fast enough for anyone, especially for those of us who fancy ourselves change agents, right? It never is going to happen fast enough. But I think that we recognize that change is hard for folks, especially if we live in a situation where folks think that change always means losing something, that you have to give up something in order for someone else to rise. I think that that's probably one of the biggest challenges for me is less about the time of the change, but how long it actually takes for folks to reduce their threat level, that they have to give up something. That to me is a little bit more frustrating than the actual time it takes, because we're all really kind of consumed by some level of self-preservation, right? And so it's gotten easier over the years. I think that as you age, you just kind of say, these things really do take time, but that doesn't mean that I haven't seen dramatic change in my time. I remember the day that things really seemed radically different for me at the AAVMC, and it was at a board meeting. And frankly, I had to go to the ladies' room, and a topic related to diversity was coming up. And I was like, can I actually leave the room? Like, I need to go. I felt like I need a bio break now. And, I took a moment and I said, you know what? I've been around for long enough, and these are really good people. And I believe in their development in this area, and I can walk away and I can go to the ladies' room for a few minutes, and they can have a meaningful conversation about diversity in academic veterinary medicine. And that was a huge moment that I felt, one, that trust had been earned, and two, the trust had been earned because I know they had done the work. And that's been a number of years ago. It's probably been a decade. It does happen. And it's always easier to look backward and feel like things happen more quickly than they probably did when you were enduring it. So
I'm glad you told that little anecdote of a story to illustrate the change that you have noticed in the profession. Peter tends to repeat a mantra that I used early in our podcast, and that is, you can't legislate hearts. One of the things I love about Peter is his passion about improvement. He has a passion for improvement in almost every area, but he also has an impatience about achieving that improvement. And like others, and many of us, expects change to be linear, when actually change, especially in social issues, seems to be circular. People
spiraling.
Yes, who are trying to revert back to the way it used to be. But one of the things that I find so interesting, and I'd like for you to comment on this, is that there has been a generational shift. You talked about being on the board of AAVMC, and I've spent almost 30-something years participating in AAVMC. I first entered the profession. I must say, frankly, that first of all, I think the veterinary profession has always been peopled by good people. The question, however, has been, what have been their opinions about social issues at that time, and what was the accepted mores at any given time? And when I entered the profession, shortly before Peter did, there was no concern about diversity, representation. As a matter of fact, it was just the opposite. It was it was expected to make it as hard as possible for certain demographics of the population to get into veterinary medicine. And that was reflected in the board as well of AAVMC. And then I also noticed in your statement, you didn't say this, but you also reminded me of the role that minorities had in any profession to speak up for minorities in any profession. And if you weren't at the table, certain important ideas would be lost or glossed over or simply ignored. And this was the chance to move something back again. And so that was a huge moment, that you could now not just trust the people that had done the work, but trust the people that had come in with different ideas, with a different understanding. That's real change.
Yeah.
To me.
Yeah.
And we don't applaud people enough for that progress.
Yeah.
And that's frustrating to people who feel they're still being blamed for things that they didn't do.
Yes.
And there's a difference between complicity and actual action. So
Yeah.
I just want you to know how deep I thought your response was. And I want to bring out some of those hidden elements that was bedded in your response.
Yeah, because I do think that I have had the privilege of being in a lot of rooms where there aren't a lot of folks that look like me. And that certainly has been a privilege, but it's also been a bit of a burden because I had to carry a lot of folks. And I'm not a veterinarian. And so on top of it, so I'm still an other, right? So I will say that one way that I have managed this, Peter, is in my heart, I'm a pragmatist. And so while I believe in changing hearts and minds, Absolutely. I want people to come on over and join the team. My pragmatism is a form of self-protection. And it means that if I can't change your hearts and, or mine, okay, I will settle for you bringing your act right to work. Right? All of the foolishness stays in the parking lot in the car. But when you're at work, there are certain expectations for inclusive, belonging behavior, respectful behavior that we need to set a bar for. I would say probably, especially in the last several years, where we've seen a national kind of change in a lot of these kinds of conversations, I've leaned even more into that. I'm like, I really want people to believe in equality and equity and justice and all of these things. But I also recognize that as I hit my kind of midlife stride, that I'm not going to be doing this for that many more years. And so I've got to save something for me too.
Yeah, so in the fullness of explanation, when I use the phrase, you can't legislate hearts, Peter and I have had discussions on the podcast. Peter has actually said, I don't understand why we even need laws to do this. And my response has been, I didn't say we didn't need legislation. We need legislation to control behavior.
Yeah.
You just can't expect legislation to change hearts.
Hearts, right.
And we need both.
Yeah.
But permanent change occurs when attitudes change.
Yeah.
In the meantime, we need to point out what is harmful in behavior.
Yeah.
And legislate that. That's why we have speed limits. So I totally concur, even though I understand that if you have to leave certain values in the parking lot, that is the base of the circular motions we take in making progress in any issue. Because those values will essentially bleed into the workplace somehow. I'm sorry, go ahead, Peter.
I'm going to use a really bad metaphor, but I think by being in the center of the milieu, I feel like the frog in the pot that doesn't feel the heat getting turned up because you're living it every day. And the changes are happening, but you're not aware of it. And so I think in some of the initial conversations that Phil and I had, where I was frustrated in the sense that I felt we were going backwards in time, and he had to have a come to Phil talk about this is where it was then, this is where it is now. It is changing. You're just not as aware of it because it's not impacting you as directly. I think sometimes I don't feel or see the changes because I'm in the middle of the mix. And I think sometimes I have to step away, and I don't do a really good job of that, step away and look. But yes, I would suggest in the last 2, 3, 4 years, the speed of change has escalated within the veterinary profession. I would suggest that the 30 years prior to that, the only thing that changed was the color of Phil's hair.
I think that the challenge in kind of measuring change for a lot of folks, and including in vet med, is that oftentimes the changes, when you get to, this big dramatic change that we've kind of maybe seen, particularly like in the summer of 2020, where there was just so much happening, it's really the result of dozens and dozens and dozens of subtle changes, right? Like nobody in that room really appreciated the fact that I got up to go to the ladies' room and take a bio break. It was a heavy moment for me, where I recognized what was happening in that moment and why it sticks out. Because I don't really going to the bathroom is not a memorable experience for most people, right, on a day-to-day basis. And so there's a lot happening kind of internally, or, things like, hey, this particular school now requires unconscious bias training for any type of selection committee. That might be one school, but that one school is also employing a couple hundred people and educating 400 students. And so that change has impact. And so thinking about kind of running up the score with small point added rather than the big touchdown. Like the touchdown is really kind of beside the point. It's really all of the little field goals along the way.
The baseball metaphor of, you got a bunt and a bloop, or a single and a bloop gets the runs in just as much as a home run is absolutely correct. I meant to ask this at the beginning because it's a good segue to tie into some of the other things in veterinary medicine. But Tell me about your pets.
So Barkley, my dog, my beloved Barkley, who is around here somewhere. But let me kind of go back. I've had a lot of pets over the years. For whatever reason, my parents insisted on purebred dogs. We had a number of Shelties. I still love Shelties. If I ever move out of a condo, I might actually get one. But, grew up around a lot of dogs. We had birds. We had pet rabbit. We had a turtle. We had all kinds of things. My mom grew up in central rural Virginia and loves animals. My dad grew up in the city and he had dogs as well. And pets have always been a part of my life. And then as I got older, became an adult, moved out, all those things. My first dog was Buddha, and Phil remembers the famous Buddha, a white little fluffy Maltese Shih Tzu mix who, I think that dog taught me what love was and unconditional love. I mean, even more than the pets I grew up with that I still miss to this day, but that dog was my dog, my first dog as an adult. And then he lived to almost 15 and died the year that I became a mom by adoption. I have a 21-year-old daughter now, but the year that we became a family, Buddha passed away. And I'm convinced that he was kind of hanging around to usher me into this next chapter. And then I immediately had to get another dog because we needed a buffer. Because it's just the two of us. I joke because I really wanted a rescue animal and I tried to get a rescue, filled out the enormous amount of paperwork that rescue organizations had and was told, that we needed a home study. And again, I just mentioned I'm an adoptive mom. We had been through a home study and had just finished having social worker visits. And I am a huge animal lover. Hear me, people. Hear me. Loved it. But what was not fitting to happen was you coming to my house to do a home visit for a dog when a whole state had decided to let me raise a human being. So those two things were really incompatible. And that's how I ended up buying Barkley off of Craigslist out of the back of a van, which I'm guessing probably the social worker, had she known that, probably wouldn't have liked that too much either. But he's now 8. He is adorable. My muse for a little Etsy store. He uses buttons to communicate because pandemic hobbies. And yeah, he's my sweet baby.
This is what I love about these conversations. Again, your answer is replete with such depth that affect not just social justice, but veterinary care, access to care, for instance. Yeah. Our concern about how different applicants for adoption, for pet adoptions, are treated according to gender and race, et cetera. You just raised the specter of it. You cut it off at the beginning because of the comparative priorities that you had. But it would have been interesting for me to find out what your experience would have been had they come in, as well as the apparent myopia in the process that has been developed that actually, in my opinion, tends to prevent adoptions that would be helpful, and the elevation of administrative tediousness to illustrate the value of the work that we're doing, with a loss of the ultimate goal.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, the whole experience was, I'd heard all kinds of stories from veterinarians about how hard it was for veterinarians to adopt from, rescue groups. And, I'm not trying to slam rescue groups. I get the lens that I get it. I appreciate it. But having just gone through a intensive situation that was being mirrored or mimicked in a way was just, I found it a little offensive. But even the application, which was extraordinarily long, asked things like, how many hours a day I was home. And I'm like, well, I mean, I'm a grown up and I work and so I work the average amount of hours that most grown-ups work. And so, and it just raised so many issues for me about how to access an animal and how to become a pet owner and all of these kinds of things. And these are things that I certainly sit around and ponder from time to time anyway, but to actually experience it firsthand was a little shocking. But what also kind of got me was when I tell that story, like when I'm giving a talk or something, and then people come up to me and they're like, but you still saved an animal. Like, so don't feel guilty. And I was like, I don't feel guilty about the crazy rescue people who wanted to come and do a home visit like my social worker. I don't feel guilty about that. And I adore my dog. But even there's still this like, hey, don't feel bad that you might have been rejected by them, because everybody, and I'm like, I rejected them before they had a chance to reject me. But I'm okay with how it played out. I'm okay with the fact that I still have this amazing critter in my house who brings me joy every day. But all of that whole chapter is a commentary on the human animal bond and what we think about it, who deserves to have the human animal bond, whether they can afford it, whether they spend enough time, whether they do this, that, and the other. And that's before you even really truly get to healthcare for the animal.
No, that's part of wellness.
Yeah.
For both. That's the human animal bond, right?
Yeah.
And I find it, I would never pass. I'm the only dean in America of a veterinary school that can't have a pet because I don't spend enough hours at home to be with my animal, and I don't have anybody else who wants to share that responsibility. I mean, actually, it's because my wife won't let me have a pet right now. I have 3 children; she has 4.
I'm not gonna let you do that to Doris on this podcast.
But I guess my bottom line is that how dare us equivocate number of hours with the ability to care. The number of hours at work with the ability to care. I understand that it is an indication, but that discussion you just had is something I've heard around admissions tables for years too. We boil it down to things that may have an impact, but don't mean as much as we think they do.
I was going to say, one of my biggest challenges as a social scientist hanging around a bunch of STEM folks is that STEM folks love to distill to quantitative metrics, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's the answer. As social scientists like to live in the gray space and really try to understand qualitatively what's going on. And I'm sure that if veterinarians and other STEM folks could distill words just into, their binary number kind of Morse code, they would probably be a lot happier. But because you could kind of just distill it to those numbers. But there's a lot of discomfort, I think, in a number of STEM fields, not just vet med, around kind of qualitative metrics on how do we really assess? I mean, yes, we can assess the human animal bond, but a lot of it's a qualitative element, right?
Well, and that is the problem with STEM. To use your phrase, STEM folk. I didn't know I was a STEM folk, but I am. But we've created our own language.
Yes.
And when we're able to translate English into numbers or translate real life into numbers, then we call it objective.
You call it programming.
Right.
Either way, we feel as if we can trust it.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. If it adds up to 15 and you need 16, then you didn't make it.
Yeah. I do think that is a challenge in STEM. And I think that it has made this work in vet med in particular, I think that in some of the other health professions that my colleagues work in, it's been easier because the connection is a lot clearer, right? Here's a physician or a nurse or a pharmacist, and here's the client. For us, there's here is the client.
Here's the patient.
The patient. And then here's the veterinarian, and there's a conversation happening above the patient, right? And so, and understanding that relationship is as valuable as the one where we have an expectation of care being given to the actual patient. I think it's been a harder thing to sell in vet med because folks are like, yeah, but the dog is a dog is a dog is a dog. And I'm like, I get what you mean. I do see that. And I understand that's your way of trying to kind of keep it clean. I was like, but that's not reality, right? That's not the rural world that we live in, that there are just these cultural nuances. There's these understandings. There's all of these kinds of things. And, I tell people now, I'm like, all you have to do, if you want to know just how extra people can be with their animals, just go on social media. What? It's a hoot, it's a real hoot. And yes, there you go. Like, if I wasn't sitting in a drafting chair, Barkley would probably be in my lap right now. It's that qualitative difference that folks are uncomfortable around because we want to be objective, right? We want to have a right answer. We want to have a clear number, even if that number has decimal points. The decimals actually are still important. And so much of life is just not measurable that way.
When Dr. Greenhill said, there you go, Dr. Weinstein had actually shifted his camera to show that his pet was sleeping in his lap.
Which is a common occurrence, as Dr. Nelson knows. I have 36 pounds of muscle sitting here. He is a COVID puppy. He came from a rescue. If they asked how much time is spent at home, which they didn't, it's 24/7, and that's how he's become. Normally, my wife is home. She's out working today. I'm at home. So there's usually somebody with him. Bruce here is putting my leg to sleep. And at some point in time, he's going to fall off because my legs are going to fall asleep. But that's neither here nor there. I have a new category now. I'm a STEM folk. So we have the social science folk and the STEM folk. I thought it was right brain and left brain and white privilege. I'm going to start it, instead of having he, she, I'm going to have STEM folk, white privilege after my name, just on these podcasts. You shared a lot of information about your relationship with your pet and the challenges and the positives. You're a consumer of veterinary services. You're an influencer of the veterinary profession. And at different levels, you're an influencer of the next generation of the veterinary profession through the colleges. And I think you're an influencer of the veterinary profession through the messaging that you share through your role through AAVMC. So you really have your fingers in a lot of pies. So I'm just curious, as you touch all of these different issues, whether it is veterinary care as a consumer, whether it's the education, or even the veterinary profession in general, what are, somewhere between 3 to 5 important issues that you see every day that you have to think about and that you maybe want to have an influence on in the veterinary field?
So, of course, AAVMC does have a director of well-being, my wonderful colleague, Dr. Mackenzie Peterson, who oversees our well-being programming. And while that's certainly not my area of, research and that type of thing, it is something that I think a lot about, because we talk about, mental health and well-being so much in the profession. I find it to be a big issue, huge issue, but probably not the way that it's usually talked about, right? So one, we spend a lot of time talking about the individual level and mental health rather than the structural kind of level. And I'll never forget the well-being summit that I went to a few years ago, and Dr. Elizabeth Strand from the University of Tennessee got up, gave opening keynote. I love Elizabeth, but she said 80% of the problem is essentially trash work environments and 20% of the problem is mental health. Then we spent the next 3 days talking about mental health. And I was like, but 80% of the problem is trash work environments. Why are we not talking about that? Because that seems to actually be the systemic issue that could alleviate some problems that individuals may be having with some personal mental health challenges. But those potentially toxic environments are also making other people sick. Maybe not to the point of, a diagnosis, but certainly one that does not support retention, those types of things, right? And so I think that until this profession is really ready to either pivot or expand that conversation to truly talk about appropriate and supportive managerial frameworks, how to run a less toxic work environment, what are some of those behaviors and characteristics that we see and healthier work environments? What types of expectations are we putting on one another, in whether it's in academia or in private practice or wherever? We're seeing a lot of folks, and folks are saying, oh, they're leaving the profession. And I'm like, are they leaving the profession or are they leaving that trash work environment and looking for something else? And maybe they hear that that other environment over there isn't to their liking either. So they're choosing to do something else. They want to remain in the profession. The other thing is that the profession it's inclusive when it wants to be with respect to practice area, right? So if you're not a clinician and you're not kind of what I call a name brand veterinarian, where you're really involved in organized veterinary medicine or going to all of the big meetings, people know you, those folks get a pass for not touching an animal, unless, right? But otherwise, it's really all about the small animal clinician. And that's something that I've seen my entire time in the profession. And it only feels, again, outsider looking in, stepping in, living in for a while, it only feels like it's a really big tent when it needs to be. I think that there's many levels of a lack of inclusion sometimes in the profession that frankly are just, reflective of the culture. I've loved working in the profession all this time, but I do see that those distinctions as important. Even for folks that want to go into corporate practice or federal practice, there's still this requirement of oftentimes of several years in clinical practice. And I'm not saying that that's not valuable. I'm just kind of saying it's easy for folks to get stuck there too. So I think that those two things are big issues. From a larger perspective, I am worried about workforce issues. I am concerned about the long-term effects for the pandemic in terms of applications. We've seen huge spikes in applications the first 2 years of the pandemic. This year was marginal, but we also know that the folks hardest hit in undergraduate programming are first gen, low income, and students of color. I am concerned about what that span of time will look like for that group to regain position, especially when it's also coming around the same time that we're expecting some changes in the undergraduate population because of low birth rates during the last recession. And so all of these things are kind of happening at the same time with respect to the workforce thing. And, lots of folks saying we have a shortage or there's going to be a shortage. We need to produce this many more. These other folks over here don't want new schools. For me, I'm seeing a threat that we may lose diversity ground. And if we lose diversity ground with students, we're so far behind with faculty that, I'm already concerned we're never going to catch up with faculty. So, I see that the workforce issue is a threat for a lot of different reasons. And I think it's something we can overcome, but it's going to require us to be intentional.
Yeah, I agree. It's definitely going to require intentionality. The workforce issue is a threat. I am not as concerned about its impact on diversity because I believe that the generational changes will essentially patch over that. But the STEM part of me says there is a threat, period, in terms of that's going to force a change in how we deliver healthcare, which for me is the answer. That's the intentionality of how we deliver healthcare, for me, affects both the toxic environment as well as access to healthcare, as well as attractiveness to future applicants. And for me, that addresses all of those issues, whether it solves it or not. I love the idea that, you're right. If the environment is so bad that that's 80% of the problem, then we have to look at this from a mortality perspective, and if mortality is actual expressed mental unwellness, then there are people who are suffering from morbidity that don't express it, that we can help with structural changes. And those structural changes will improve medical care as well. I love the depthness of your concerns. Having been in the trenches, and I am more and more impressed with the quality of our student body, and think that at least from certain perspectives, there will be a natural trend toward positive outcomes. However, without intentionality, they could easily become discouraged in our present structural environment if we don't change things now, and that is our challenge, really, because we have people who are going to be here for the next 30 years, who will be decision makers about the profession.
Yeah. I mean, I do, I see, again, I'm on social media a lot, and I already see pre-vet students kind of being poisoned around just how sick, folks are in veterinary medicine from a mental health perspective, right? And it's a complicated thing because one, now we're set like, oh, well, we should screen for resilience. And like, let me put a pin in that because I want to come back to that. The idea, I have some very strong thoughts on resilience piece, but we want to screen for this and we want to screen for that. And I'm like, okay, so now we're just going to introduce intentional ableism. So we're not like, no, we're not going to do that. How are we cultivating young people in a profession and modeling behaviors for them to have the type of professional life that they deserve, that they can have?
And there are countercurrents, right? I mean, this isn't the first time we've had members of the profession that raise the flag and say, this sucks, don't become a veterinarian. I mean, I remember in the 90s, we had that trend. We actually had to socially condemn those people who were actually making things worse because of their own experiences. And so this to me is just a resurgence of that subtle wave, right? But at the same time, the applicants that I see are as motivated to become veterinarians as I was.
Yeah.
And I can't tell you how many people told me, what the hell do you think you're doing? Why would you want to be a veterinarian? First of all, you can make so much more money being a doctor, and you're smart enough to be one. And secondly, who needs a veterinarian right now? And I was too committed, too stubborn. I don't know what it was, but I wanted to be a veterinarian. I never changed. I love Peter's phrase that certain people have a mutation for this profession, a genetic mutation, and you can't talk them out of it. You have a very prescient understanding that some people who are discouraged of veterinary medicine or with their particular environment think that they have to leave veterinary medicine. So, to answer your question, are they leaving the profession or just leaving their environment? My answer is both.
Yeah.
Because some people have a limited view about how to solve their problem.
Yeah.
I want to go back to the well-being component, and I think you hit the proverbial nail on the head when you talked about 20% do have some clinical mental health issues, and 80% have an environmental disease.
Yeah.
And I think we have focused so much on the outcome, but not the cause.
Yeah.
And I really think the research is lacking in a cause. I fully agree with you that we have a toxic environment in many situations. And I think that toxic environment is a cause for a lot of the issues that we have in terms of longevity within the profession.
Yeah.
Because there's a tendency to extrapolate, well, if it's like this in one practice, it's like this in all practices, which isn't the case. I did a talk in Fetch called The Fear-Free Practice for Employees. Because, and I talked to Marty Becker afterwards because I was concerned that I was stepping on his toes, but with the fear-free practice for patients and clients, but we need to create less of a fearful work environment and support the needs of our employees as career employees, not just space occupying legions who have a job.
Yeah.
So the story that you talked about, the well-being side of things and pivoting so quickly from the multitude of causes to just one, I think we're missing out. And I think a lot of the issues that feed into well-being are enabled by the veterinary press. They tend to focus on the negativity. I don't see a lot of practices that are positive and successful being celebrated, and we really should be spending more time celebrating the successful practices, models for others, instead of picking on the toxic practices and trying to figure out how we deal with those sorts of things. So I really do want to give you a high five across the country for identifying that, recognizing it, and calling it out and calling what it is, because I think it's an issue that we don't always wrap our arms around. And since I have the microphone, I'm going to continue because I know if I don't get it, I'm going to not get a minute. You also talked about the lack of inclusion globally, and I would agree with you. I think we tend to silo very easily within this profession, whether it is AAVMC versus AVMA versus AAVMC versus some other acronym, or, well, you're a small animal clinician, you can't be a food animal clinician, you can't be an equine clinician. So we create our own little silos even within the profession, which creates its own barriers and its own levels of toxicity from that standpoint. So all of these things impact workforce retention, because I think some of the problem we're dealing with post-COVID, post-pandemic, is not a need to fill the funnel. I think it's a need to stop the funnel from leaking and keeping people in the profession by being more inclusive at all levels, from the animal caretaker to the veterinarian. And we're so focused on putting more in the funnel, which, if we don't stop the leak, will not help the problem at all. I'm done.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that and to Phil's point about, the experiential things that students are pre-vet students do, and these experiences that they have. If we don't go in with very clear expectations and understanding what it is that is expected of us, then our natural inclination is to do more of whatever it is the base expectation is, right? Like, I tell you to jump, you ask me how high, and I say, I'll let you know when you get there. Like, just keep jumping, right? Yeah, that looks good. And I think that some of that is just kind of happening out in the field. And I think that these expectations of also being a public facing profession, sometimes more challenging for some folks, not all, but I mean, the thing about toxic environments is that every environment only needs one toxic person to kind of spoil the thing, right? These expectations about being forward facing. A lot of folks say, oh, I don't really like people, I want to go into vet medicine. And I'm like, there's a lot of people. There's still a lot of people. And oh my goodness, the clients are mean to us. And I'm like, they're mean to the people at Chipotle too. They're really mean to the people at Chipotle and Target and Walmart. And I was like, part of that is the nature of customer service. Are we training folks to deal with the public? But more than that, from an academic and a learning perspective, is one, were you prepared for that expectation that you're going to be working with the public? And number two is, do you have the conflict resolution skills that you need? Number three is, if the client is mad at you, and I'm not saying the client is always right, because I get it, but perhaps, the burden is actually on the professional to manage that conversation such that that person has the information that they need. Yes, you want that person coached to ask the right questions and blah, 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 blah. But the professional to some degree bears a lot of that burden. And so if folks are really upset, then let's talk about how some of these scenarios are going that lead to the problem before Toxic Tim comes out and everything kind of blows up. And so I absolutely believe that a lot of folks are doing the best that they can, especially these last few years, challenging circumstances that all of us are stressed. There's always more expectations, but I do think that looking inward a bit at that kind of group level to see, do we have the skills that we really need to do the work with the public that we are called to do? And I'm not sure that those two things are always matching up the way that they should.
The other interesting thing is this profession, especially the small animal part of it, is a relatively new component. We're not that far back from being mixed animal practitioners. And the human animal bond and the role that Barkley plays in your life and Bruce plays in mine has become one of being out in the backyard to being in our laps. And so we are still trying to figure out what this modeling and profession is going to look like. Human healthcare changes from a technology standpoint, but the patient remains the same. Our relationship with animals has changed dramatically over the last 50 years. And the expectations from consumers has changed dramatically over the last 50 years. But I'm not sure we have learned how to match the two.
Yeah.
Don't forget to join us for part 2 of this conversation next week.
Thank you for joining us for another courageous conversation. Be sure to follow us and check back next week for more.